The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, which lasted from about 9,000 to 5,000 BCE, got its name partly from the sophistication of the stone tools that people were using. Humans had begun to plant seeds and herd animals, and they were becoming farmers. Dependence on agriculture and herded animals had developed even earlier, throughout the pre-Neolithic period, and now there was really no turning back. People still fished, hunted for birds, and gathered some plants, but the bulk of their diet came from farming. The evidence for this comes from seeds and bones found at archaeological sites. Domestication changed the species slightly. Shapes of seeds and of horn cores tell us that the plants and animals were controlled by humans. They weren't wild anymore. Farming became common throughout northern Mesopotamia and the Levant, where enough rain fell. This was still before the invention of pottery, in an era known as the pre-pottery Neolithic. One remarkable discovery from the period comes from the site of Jericho. This Neolithic community of about 300 people was built in the desert next to a gushing spring, which made life possible there. The inhabitants were able to devise ways to water their crops, as well as to use the water for drinking and washing. They even built a stone wall around their town that was 9 feet thick and 12 feet high. The Neolithic villagers also built a large stone tower, about 28 feet high and 21 feet across the top, with a staircase inside. There is nothing like it anywhere else from this period, and it has mystified archaeologists and historians. Was it a defensive tower to protect the community? Was it for ceremonial purposes? Was it a lookout platform to protect the spring? Perhaps the wall was needed to defend stores of grain from raiding neighbors, though some scholars think it was protection against flooding. No matter why these structures were built, they must have taken considerable planning and effort, and a lot of manpower. People must have felt that the buildings were important. Stable and somewhat larger communities like this one developed new technologies, and surprisingly extensive contacts between communities spread the new technologies widely. So, when something new was invented, a new style of stone tool, for example, we can see that the ideas spread by the fact that examples of these same types of tools are found in archaeological sites distributed over hundreds of square miles. Sometimes, when I'm hiking in the countryside near my home, I think about those ancient people whose only way to contact one another over long distances was to head out and walk there. Imagine the hardships they faced, all the bad weather, difficult terrain, and predatory animals. Lions were native to the Near East long after this, even when cities were founded. Traveling would have been difficult and dangerous. So if a type of object is found spread out over a wide area in the Neolithic period, does that mean that people took these objects with them when they walked to some very distant place, maybe hundreds of miles away? A good example is obsidian. Obsidian is a form of naturally occurring glass and is the best possible stone for tools. It has a razor-sharp edge when you break it. Until quite recently, obsidian blades were used in surgery. Obsidian could also be polished to make mirrors. So it was something that lots of people must have wanted, and it's one of the earliest goods to have been traded over long distances. Obsidian from Anatolia, which is now Turkey, has been found at Neolithic sites right across the Near East, and even in the lands around the Aegean Sea. It was obviously very highly valued. Other things were transported far away from their places of origin as well. Seashells are found hundreds of miles from the sea, and marble bracelets were popular in many places. Bitumen from Mesopotamia was also traded across hundreds of miles. Bitumen is a sticky tar substance like asphalt that could be used for waterproofing boats and baskets. It's related to oil, and of course there's a lot of oil in the Near East. But in ancient times, the only use they had for bitumen was for waterproofing. Some scholars think this amazing evidence of ancient trade doesn't mean that people were actually traveling over long distances. Perhaps dozens of middlemen were involved, each exchanging the obsidian or some other material for something valuable, and the person they traded with then traded it with someone else. Perhaps none of them had any idea of how far the goods had traveled from their places of origin in order to reach them. This seems like a reasonable assumption, that no single person traveled very far, even though the traded goods themselves did. And yet, this assumption might not have been true. The spread of farming gives us some evidence about this. Did people hear about farming and begin to try it? Did they trade the things they needed in order to farm, the sheep, goats, cattle, barley and wheat, one village at a time, spreading the ideas and the domesticates slowly? Or did farmers move from their homeland in the Near East to places hundreds or thousands of miles away, bringing the technology and domesticates with them? That last idea seemed far-fetched until recently. But DNA studies have shown that 80% of Europeans are descended from ancient Near Eastern farmers. The Europeans are also, of course, descended from indigenous populations who inhabited Europe before farming, and from any number of other groups who migrated into Europe at other times. Any one person could have millions of ancestors. The number varies depending on how much the same families continue to intermarry over time. But the fact that for 80% of Europeans, their DNA includes the DNA of ancient Near Eastern peoples means that farmers traveled in the Neolithic period and settled in new places, bringing their sheep, goats, wheat, and barley with them. The DNA of European cattle shows that they too had a Near Eastern origin. We also know, again from DNA, that millet, which is a grain or cereal crop, spread from as far away as China, coming to Eastern Europe at around the same time. A lot of people were moving around, bringing new technologies, new domesticates, and new ideas with them. So Neolithic people were more mobile than you might have expected. Some of the other technologies that began to develop in the Near East made new use of an old friend of humankind, fire. Hundreds of thousands of years before this, even before modern humans evolved, people's lives had been improved a lot by controlling fire. They used it for protection and warmth and for cooking. But in the Neolithic era, they also started using it to change natural materials like stone and clay into other forms. The first of these was plaster. To make lime plaster, you have to burn limestone, which becomes a powder. Then you add water, spreading or molding the plaster into a desired shape and letting it dry. The drying process can take a long time, but at the end, the plaster becomes hard and stone-like and resistant to water. The ancient pre-pottery Neolithic people in the Levant discovered this, and they used lime plaster to coat floors and walls. Imagine the improvement over a mud floor. The plaster could be washed and swept and covered with rugs for warmth. Plaster had other uses as well. It could be formed into sculptures, like the human figures found at the site of Ain Ghazal in Jordan. These are half life-size, with painted clothing and hair, and cowrie shells inlaid for the eyes. The Neolithic people in the Near East also used plaster to commemorate the dead. At many sites, archaeologists have found skulls separated from skeletons, with facial features reproduced in plaster, and sometimes with cowrie shells in the eye sockets. Strangely enough, these were often found in houses, right where the people lived and worked. They might have been the skulls of family ancestors, and they can be eerily lifelike. Perhaps the ancestors were worshipped, or perhaps the people believed these dead men and women watched over their families and protected them. It might seem macabre to us, but the Neolithic farmers apparently didn't think so. They also experimented with making containers out of plaster. These are called whiteware. A whiteware vessel is like a stone bowl, but it didn't have to be laboriously carved and ground into shape. It could be molded and left to set. Once dry and solid, it could hold water and other liquids and foods. But it had a problem. It couldn't be used for cooking. Put lime plaster over fire, and the lime reverts to powder. Whiteware wasn't produced for long, and it didn't spread to other regions. It was a good invention, but another one was coming along that was even better. In fact, the invention of whiteware might have even spurred that next invention. what if you could shape a vessel out of a different kind of substance and somehow involve fire in the process and get something more useful? There were, of course, other kinds of containers in early Neolithic times. Archaeologists do find some stone bowls, but they would have taken a long time to make, carving and grinding the stone into shape. And people must have had leather bags, baskets, and nets. The Neolithic people were familiar with clay and mud. They used it to make bricks, which, after being left out in the sun to dry, were hard enough to build a wall with. So, after plaster, the next great fire-related invention was pottery. This was truly revolutionary. Think of all the things you can do with pots. You can drink from them, eat from them, store things in them, including liquids, make them in a vast variety of sizes and shapes, from tiny to coffin-sized. And they did bury people in them. And of course, you can cook in them. Pots are just fine over flame. They don't break or decompose. Whole new culinary possibilities now opened up to the ancient villagers. People could now make porridge from grain, cooking it over the heat in a pot. And they could make soups and stews. Meat was not just roasted anymore. They also used clay to build beehive-shaped ovens, and they baked flat bread inside. These ovens, which are called tanurs, are found in ancient villages and are still used across the Middle East. Initially, in the first half of the 7th millennium BCE, pottery was fairly coarse, including some large storage vessels and small bowls. But quite quickly, the technology improved and the ceramics became what we might consider works of art. People painted patterns on their pots with glazes so that the patterns were fired right onto the surface. Some designs show stick figures of people and animals, but mostly they were decorated with detailed and meticulous geometric patterns. Pots weren't just useful for the ancient people. They're also really useful for modern archaeologists. Mostly, a broken pot is just trash. But that trash lasts pretty much forever. Unlike organic materials like baskets and bags, potsherds don't decompose. And, unlike metal objects, which were invented later, they don't corrode and they can't be melted down and reused. A potsherd found in the ground today looks almost exactly the same as when it was thrown away thousands of years ago. So when archaeologists find broken pieces of pottery all over the ground in places where ancient people lived, they can use these potsherds to figure out when a site was occupied. Pottery went through phases, like fashions. Sometimes the fabric of the pot was yellow, sometimes reddish or brown. Sometimes the glazes were shiny, sometimes matte. The shapes changed, as did the thickness of the ceramic walls. A fragment of pottery is as datable as a car design. You wouldn't mistake a 1948 Ford for a 1992 Toyota. Archaeologists have that same eye for pots. They can tell Neolithic pots from later ones and can identify more or less when they were made. So when they find pottery fragments dating to a particular era, they know the site was occupied at that time. Most Neolithic settlements were still small villages, but the villagers began to experiment with new construction techniques. In the 8000s BCE, even before pottery was invented, people had begun to use bricks for construction and built their houses in rectangular shapes. We're so used to rectangular rooms that they don't seem exceptional at all. But initially, they were revolutionary. Square corners allowed more houses to be built next to one another. An extreme case of this is seen in the city of Çatalhöyük in Turkey. Çatalhöyük is a remarkable place, a veritable town of maybe hundreds of inhabitants that thrived around 6000 BCE. That was a time when most other communities were just the size of villages. Çatal had regular rectangular buildings all jammed up against one another without doors and without streets in between. So you had to enter your house by a ladder from the roof. The ladder was almost always on the south side of the building for some reason, with the hearth and the oven under the entry hole in the ceiling. This lack of doors and streets might have been good for the town's protection, whether from other people, animals, or the elements. It gets very cold on the Anatolian plateau in the winter and very hot in the summer, so all those adjacent walls would have served as insulation against the weather extremes. But this also meant that people had to learn how to live peacefully with one another in very close quarters. The walls and floors of the houses in Çatalhöyük were almost all plastered with lime plaster. So were the brick benches that lined some of the walls and the raised platforms that were found in every house. And some of the walls were brightly painted. Some of the rooms in Çatalhöyük had plaster sculptures on the walls in the shapes of the heads of cattle and female figures. The first excavations at Çatalhöyük were directed by James Mellart. Mellart called these rooms shrines, and he thought they had a religious purpose. Professor Ian Hodder, who has worked to excavate Çatal, believes that these pictures and sculpted figures represent a crucial development. People had to overcome their fears of wild animals and death before they could truly domesticate the natural world. By creating artworks that showed things that they feared, and even having them inside their homes, they were able to start to control their environments. Now, remember that these people were just like modern humans in terms of their mental and physical abilities. They didn't have a way to write down their ideas, so we don't know what they were thinking. But we can be sure that they talked and planned, and that some people came up with exciting new ideas. We can also be sure that they mourned their dead. There were about 480 burials in the small area of Çatalhöyük that has been excavated. Almost all of them are under the platforms in the houses. It looks as though some of the bodies were excarnated before burial. The flesh had been removed. This might have been taken care of by vultures, as shown in the wall paintings. A family's ancestors were safely buried right beneath the floors where their descendants lived and slept. Like earlier people in the Levant, they plastered some of the skulls and painted them red. The people clearly had religious ideas that might have had something to do with the plaster models of bulls and females. And they probably had a belief in an afterlife and a sense that dead ancestors had some sort of continuing power in the world of the living. But it's impossible to figure out the details. Çatalhöyük had been occupied for centuries before the time of the town that Mellart and Hodder excavated. There are lots of occupation levels below the excavated ones, from time periods before the Neolithic. The people who first settled there probably chose the site because it was close to a river and also near a volcano where they could pick up obsidian. The people of Çatalhöyük might have been on one end of a trading network, benefiting from the fact that they were able to trade obsidian with other regions. Imported seashells were also found at the site. Even at this early time, when no one seems to have been richer than anyone else, people already seem to have had a desire for beautiful things that weren't available near home. Most of Mesopotamia, that's modern Iraq, was pretty much uninhabited at this time. It's just too hot and dry. Other than at Jericho, which is near the Jordan River, and at a few other isolated places, people could farm only if there was enough rainfall to water their crops. They hadn't yet started digging canals from the local rivers to water their fields that way. Some recent excavations, though, show there were a number of early Neolithic farming settlements in the far south around the Persian Gulf. One theory is that what is now the Persian Gulf wasn't filled with water until about 14,000 years ago. It was a deep valley, and ancient hunters and gatherers lived there in the so-called Gulf Oasis. Then, between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose and swamped more than 100,000 square kilometers of land with seawater. Even after this inundation, there was still much more dry land around the Gulf than today, and Neolithic villages prospered. The cattle that they herded had local origins, but their sheep had come from further north. Interestingly, this might be where cats were first domesticated. Some scholars think cats domesticated themselves in a way. They were drawn to the rodents that would have populated human settlements, and they began to live comfortably among humans, even though the people who resided there didn't necessarily do anything to encourage them. And cats' personalities haven't changed. They still don't seem to need us all that much. They just grace us with their presence. Around 6000 BCE, farmers began to move south from the foothills into the floodplain of Mesopotamia as they figured out how to dig irrigation canals to water their crops. The Mesopotamian plain is very flat. It consists of thousands of years of silt laid down by the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This silty soil is rich and fertile when watered, so the irrigated fields would have produced plenty of food. The situation in ancient Egypt was similar, but with some important differences. In Egypt, the annual flood arrived right before the sowing season. As soon as the waters receded, farmers planted their seeds, and the ground was wet enough to need minimal additional irrigation. The land produced abundant crops with little need for human intervention beyond sowing, tending, and harvesting. Mesopotamian farmers had a much more difficult situation as they tried to use the river water to irrigate their fields. One difference from Egypt is the Mesopotamian rivers were, in places, higher than the land. This was an advantage in a way. If you breached the natural levee on either side, some of the river water flowed downhill into your fields. It didn't need to be lifted into irrigation canals with buckets. You just needed to be sure to have a way of controlling or stopping the flow when necessary. But when the annual floods came and river waters spilled over the banks, there was no guarantee the river would end up flowing along the same course as before. If your village was near the banks of a river, which almost all of them were, so the villagers could use the water for irrigation, you could be out of luck if the river rerouted itself after the flooding receded. Another problem for farmers in Mesopotamia was the flood came at the wrong time of year. Seeds needed to be sowed in the spring, but the flood came in early summer. The floodwaters would have washed away the young plants. So from the start, Mesopotamians who moved into the river valleys needed to find ways to control the rivers, making sure they didn't change course and they didn't flood the fields at the wrong times. This meant the villagers needed to join forces to do some pretty big construction projects, such as reinforcing and raising levees on both banks of the river and protecting fields with dikes and reservoirs. These efforts became a constant feature of Mesopotamian life and meant that communities always had to work together. It was too much labor for one family or even a group of families to manage alone. Some of the earliest communities to spread into central Mesopotamia from the north belonged to the Samarran culture, which is named after the site of Samarra where their pottery was first identified. Samarran pottery is very distinctive, with a matte finish, and it's often decorated with drawings of animals and humans in black paint. Sometimes even the necks were shaped with three-dimensional human faces and eyes shaped like coffee beans stuck on as appliques. These types of pots are found all across central and northern Mesopotamia. They seem to have been valuable trade items. They were even sometimes repaired with bitumen, that sticky tar substance, when the pots broke. The repaired item would not have been very sturdy or useful for cooking, but it must have been treasured by the people who owned it. The Samarran people also used clay to make figurines, often with those same coffee bean eyes as on some of the pots. Most were of women, who were depicted with necklaces and designs on their bodies that might have represented tattoos. The site of Tel Es-Sawan is probably the best-known Samarran site. It's in an area that sometimes had enough rainfall for agriculture, but the weather was unreliable. Early farmers were able to use the annual flooding of local streams to supplement the rainfall. Later, they seem to have dug irrigation canals and begun the long Mesopotamian struggle to bring their rivers and streams under control. The buildings at Tel Es-Sawan are surprisingly large and T-shaped, and the exterior walls had some niches and buttresses, which later became characteristic of Mesopotamian architecture. Almost all of these houses were the same size and shape, probably with one dwelling per family. There's no sign that anyone was particularly rich or poor. The population seems to have been fairly equal, but they must have had some sort of village-level organization in order to plan their irrigation activities. The people there grew several kinds of wheat as well as barley. Bones found at the site show they herded sheep and goats, which no doubt provided wool and milk, and they owned cattle. They also still hunted wild gazelle, deer, and boar, and they fished as well. A culture that flourished after the Samarran and to the north of it is known as the Halaf. The Halaf culture flourished across northern Mesopotamia and even into Syria and southern Anatolia, from around 5700 to 5000 BCE. This whole region has enough rainfall for agriculture, so they didn't need to irrigate their fields. The Halaf people built both round and rectangular houses, and mostly lived in small villages, where they farmed the same crops and herded the same animals that we've come across out everywhere. The thing that stands out most is that the Halaf people made incredibly beautiful ceramics. The pots were handcrafted in elegant shapes with detailed and meticulous designs, and they seem to have been traded far and wide. Or perhaps they were made by potters who moved from town to town. Halaf pots reflect such a high level of craftsmanship that archaeologists believe they must have been made by specialists, people who made pots for a living, rather than your typical farmer. These men, or perhaps women, would have depended on exchanging the pots they made for food. So, by 5000 BCE, the farmers of the Neolithic period had spread right across the Near East, even into areas where they couldn't depend on rainfall to water their crops, and where they needed to irrigate their fields. They also traded with one another over very long distances for valuable goods like seashells for jewelry, bitumen for waterproofing, obsidian for stone tools, and even handmade goods like beautiful pots. A few of the villages grew to the size of towns, such as Jericho and Çatalhöyük, with hundreds of residents. But most communities were still relatively small. And although some people must have specialized in particular crafts, there don't seem to have been any distinctions between rich and poor people yet. But that was about to change.